And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Barry Burden, who's an associate professor of government at Harvard University. His field is American politics, and he specializes in political psychology and elections and voting behavior, which we've all had quite a bit of this week. And so we're very excited that he's joining us tonight to shed some light on what all those polls and surveys mean and what they can tell us about the mind of the American voter. So please welcome Dr. Barry Burden.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here at the end of an exhausting week, at least for me, and a windy evening. It's great to see you all here on a blustery Friday night. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the science of surveys. There is a science involved. There's an awful lot of art too, and I'll try to talk about both of those things. But I want to suggest to you that there are at least some scientific principles that you got to be aware of when you think about it, at a minimum, consuming surveys and what to do when you encounter them. We're going to start with this opening premise that doing a survey is more than simply collecting or gathering up opinions that are waiting out there in the public to be harvested. This is not like picking corn or collecting trash cans. There's much more involved, and I'm going to highlight several kinds of issues that make the process a difficult one tonight. First are what I would call technological issues. These are issues that have to do with the sampling itself. How do we identify the people we'd like to talk to, and what modes do we use for contacting them? So a serious set of issues, and ones that are largely behind the scenes and thus not public for most of us, but I want to give you a sense for what happens there. Another set of issues have to do with the psychology of the measurement of opinion itself. How does the interface between an interviewer and a respondent on the other end of the phone, or an interviewer and a respondent at their doorstep, affect the nature of the kinds of responses you get to a survey? So there are those psychological issues for us to consider, and they are many and fun. So we'll be getting to those midway through. And then we'll think at the end about how we learn about surveys. How is it that journalists go about reporting to us the complicated things that go on behind the scenes? And what pieces of information do we need to critically evaluate surveys when we encounter poll data in the course of an election campaign or anywhere else? I should point out, given where we are relative to an election, that political surveys, and particularly campaign-related surveys, are a very small fraction of all the survey research that's done in this country and around the world. The large majority has to do with consumer research. It's about interviewing people who are about to buy something. And so companies invest in learning about the opinions of those folks, whether it's by a telephone survey or a focus group or other matter, and you may have been involved in some of those over time. For example, the Nielsen ratings you may have heard of for television broadcast are a major kind of survey that goes on that has very little to do with politics. And so just be aware we're talking about a thin slice of what happens, but at least in my mind, an important slice. I'm going to talk about surveys in the context of problems. These are roadblocks or stumbling issues you'd like to avoid if you were developing a survey yourself. And these are things that pollsters have to navigate as they develop surveys, as they identify people they want to talk to, as they develop questions they think are measuring the kinds of things they'd like to tap, and as they go about reporting. And we're going to divide tonight's lecture into three types of problems or concerns that we need to deal with. The first is that of what I'm going to call sampling error. You sometimes hear about this in the form of the margin of error. What's the amount of uncertainty that surrounds the kinds of things that we're reporting when we say that 27% of the American public believes X or is about to do item Y, plus or minus 3 points, plus or minus 8 points, or whatever the margin of error may be? How do we arrive at that number, and what does it mean for us in terms of running away with the 27% number or any other value that's given to us? Second issue, and one that is more serious and yet we know less about as a public, is the bias in sampling. How well does the sample we draw, the respondents we'd like to speak to, represent the larger population about which we want to generalize? And this is a terribly difficult issue, as we find increasing numbers of people don't want to talk to us. Telemarketing and cell phones and other things have made Americans of all types wary of pollsters, even though we promise we're not selling anything or asking much of you other than your opinions. Finally, there's this massive looming issue of measurement. How do we measure opinions? By definition, our opinions are something you can't see. They're not something that are public. They're a hodgepodge of attitudes and other considerations, emotions and thoughts and pieces of information that float around in people's heads, not necessarily consistent or coherent or waiting to be gathered in a sort of collecting sort of way. So how does that translation happen? from the privately held views we have to some public statement that a pollster would like to add to a data set. So these are three sets of issues, and we'll take them in order. And I think I've ordered them this way in part because measurement is the more severe of the three, and sampling error, even though it's the one we hear the most about, is the least important of the three and least severe because we have such a strong sense of the degree to which it's a problem. How can a survey be accurate if I've never been called? I can't tell you how many times I've heard this question. I'm not sure I've ever been called by a pollster. Give it some more time, maybe it'll happen. The short answer is that you don't need to talk to very many people within a population to say something in general about what that population is like. The analogies I'll draw for you are, imagine you're making some soup this Thanksgiving, and in one household someone's mixing up a small tureen of soup, mixing things together, and they like to taste it along the way. How much of that soup do you need to taste to get a sense for its quality? Assuming you've mixed it thoroughly, that all the good stuff isn't sitting on the bottom and all the bubbles have risen to the top, assuming it's mixed in a random sort of way, you just need a small spoonful, right? And maybe you need a second opinion, but all you need are a small amount. And it doesn't matter whether you're mixing a small pot of soup or a large cauldron over a fire. The same spoonful will work. The same is true of drawing blood. A phlebotomist who takes a bit of blood to count your white cells or something else, how much is required from the human body? Sometimes a drop to put on a microscope slide. It doesn't matter whether the blood's being drawn from an elephant that weighs 2 tons or a small child who weighs 30 pounds. A drop or two is all that's necessary, assuming the blood is sort of randomly distributed in the body, which it's not exactly, but we at least know how that process works. So I introduce our first two terms tonight. One is that of a population. That's the large group of individuals or things about which we want to generalize. And if you're a marketer, this could be the snowboarding public or the television viewing public. You name it. It's the group about which you want to say something. For pollsters during an election campaign, it's often either all American adults or perhaps all people who are eligible to vote or all of those who are likely to vote. And that's a terribly important issue in how you screen from one to the next. Nonetheless, it's the group of people about which you want to say something. And that group might be 1,000 on a college campus, or it might be 10 million in a state, or it might be 200 million adults around the world. Regardless of the size of that population, the magic of sampling theory is such that you need the same size sample regardless, just the way the same bit of soup tells you how the whole batch is regardless of how big that batch is. Okay, so the denominator is unimportant for most purposes, as long as you have at least a few thousand people. What we draw from that is a sample, and that's the small point here. In fact, if we're talking about Americans during an election campaign, we've got roughly 120 million voters this time around. Most samples are in the order of 500 to 1,000. So I've made that point bigger than it really is. We're taking a very small sliver of the American public and generalizing from that to say something about all Americans. And that spot, we hope, is not all located in one place. We hope that a nationally representative telephone survey, for example, doesn't just call women or just call people living in Wyoming or just call people under 18. We hope that it's actually a series of little tiny spots all over that larger circle. Nonetheless, you get the idea. And the magic listed at the bottom here is really emphasizing that point that the size of the population, how big that blue circle is unimportant for how big the sample is. All that matters is the size of that pink dot in the center. The trouble with public opinion is this: the truth is unknowable. Forget the other issues we're going to be coming to in a few minutes about how we measure opinions and whether the wording of questions can change the kind of responses we get, whether you can manipulate public opinion by altering the wording, some of which is true. Even if we set those things aside, we will never know what percentage of the American public approves of the way George W. Bush is handling his job as president. We'll never know what percentage of the American public thinks that No Child Left Behind is a good or bad policy. Because, first of all, there's no list of the American public to ask. And even if there were, no one has the time or resources to interview all those people. Simply impossible. The closest we have to that is the census, which is done every 10 years. It's not a sample. We're trying to count all the people in that large blue circle because the Constitution requires it. And even then, we're likely to miss 4 or 5 or in some cases 8 million people. Simply difficult to do. In the process of the counting, in fact, some people are dying and new people are being born and they're becoming older and the world is changing as we're doing the counting. And so it's a terribly difficult process. And so the trouble with polling, an inherent part of polling, in fact, is that every estimate we derive about some characteristic of the population is going to be surrounded by some uncertainty, some plus or minus factor. Nothing we can do about it. What we can do is try to make it as small as possible. And so what I'm showing here is a relationship between two things. Along the x-axis at the bottom is the sample size. This is the size of that pink dot from a couple slides back. It's the number of people we end up talking to in a survey. And by the way, this could be talking to on the phone, this could be responding to an email, this could be completing a survey at an exit poll or something else. It's the number of people who are responding. And the typical range for these things is anywhere from very small, such as my laser pointer here, the dot's getting smaller, to somewhere around 1,000 or 2,000. And what I have along the y-axis is the margin of error. That's that plus or minus stuff you see in the fine print below most reported surveys. And the relationship is largely negative. That is, the smaller the sample is, the larger the margin of error. The bigger the sample is, the smaller the margin of error. But there are diminishing returns. So having a sample of 10,000 is not much better than having a sample of 2,000. But having a sample of 500 here would give you a margin of error of what, if I'm reading this properly, plus or minus about 4 points. So improving to a sample of 1,000 gets you a little bit, right? It drops the margin of error from plus or minus 4 to plus or minus 3. Now imagine you're a media outlet or an academic outfit or a newspaper, say, doing a poll. The additional cost of going from 500 respondents to 1,000 respondents is huge. You're paying interviewers by the hour to do this sort of work. You're paying long distance charges. You're paying for overhead in the building and computer time and so on. And yet, for all that work, interviewing twice as many people, you've only lowered the margin of error from 4 points to 3. So we find that most surveys, at least before the very end of the campaign, are running in this range, 4 to 500. Now think about going back on the scale just a bit, interviewing, say, 200 or 300 people. You've now escalated the margin of error to somewhere between 5 and 10 points. Having a smaller sample, interviewing just 100 people, would give you a massive margin of error, plus or minus 10 points. Simply not acceptable. Right? If we hear from a survey that 50% of the American public prefers Bush and 50% prefer Kerry, and there's a margin of error of 10, right, that estimate is pretty useless. But the additional work that would be required to get that down to 2 or 3 points isn't worth it in most pollsters' mind. So we end up sort of in this middle range with most surveys, somewhere between the mid-hundreds and below 1,000 to get a handle on the margin of error, and that's the figure that's reported in the fine print with most of the surveys you encounter. One detail about that, and one extra, can I fix this? I can. Science. One detail about that is the margin of error that's given is actually the most conservative estimate of that margin of error. It's the worst it could be given the marginals or the overall frequencies we get from any particular question. The plus or minus 4% you get from a survey of roughly 500 only happens at the point where the percentage in some category, imagine a question that's, do you approve or disapprove of the way George W. Bush is handling his job as president? Today, about 50% of people say they approve and about 50% say they disapprove. So we're in this range near the middle of the scale. It's at that point where the margin of error is at its worst. And this is for a sample size of about 500. As those responses get closer to 100%, say a 90-10 split, or closer to the other end of the scale, a 10-90 split, the margin of error shrinks. So what's reported sometimes seems difficult to wrestle with. How do we know what the truth is if the margin of error is plus or minus 4? But that's actually the worst case scenario. The margin of error is different on every single question in the survey. So with 10 different questions, the margin of error isn't known until we get the responses back, right? And it's only at that maximum when the responses are near the middle of the spectrum. So just something to be aware of. We're giving you the most conservative of all estimates when you hear those sorts of things. So on our first point that the margin of error is something to deal with, that sampling error is a concern for pollsters, I want to make 4 points. One is you ought to know it's there, that any estimate we get from a survey is associated with some uncertainty. It has some noise around it and is simply unknowable. When we're told that the margin of error, for example, is 4%, plus or minus 4 percentage points, that means that if we did the survey over and over and over, say 100 times, we expect that 95 of those 100 times will be within plus or minus 4 points of the truth, even though that truth is not knowable. And that comes from statistical theory. The other thing to be aware of, though, is because most surveys would like to make the margin of error small, but don't want to invest so many resources that they make it go away because of the diminishing returns, the margin of error is about the same in most credible surveys, 3 or 4 or 5 points. And so that fine print doesn't much mean anything to most of us. Just be aware that any survey result you hear could have a margin of error plus or minus 4 or 5 points. Okay, simply be aware of that. And so even though it's the one detail we get above all other details, in some ways it's the least meaningful. In part because it gives us this, a false sense of security. It implies there's something more scientific going on than there really is. that all the other kinds of things that get in the way of measuring public opinion, the things we're going to be coming to shortly, the bias in the sample and the design of the questionnaire itself, are so trivial that all that matters is this plus or minus stuff. In fact, the plus or minus stuff is the least trivial itself, and it's those other things that end up mattering more, but we know less about. And so this is the least of our problems, and yet it's the one that tends to be reported. But it makes us feel good. It makes a journalist feel good to say, we know the truth within plus or minus some factor. So that's our sampling error lesson. Something to be aware of. It certainly exists, but not something that is determinative in most cases. So let's go to item 2 in my list of things to be aware of, and that is what I'm going to call sample bias. Sample bias. Sampling error is random. It's something we can control in the sense that we know about the distribution of responses to surveys, and so we can estimate its value. Sample bias we can sometimes estimate and sometimes cannot. The question here is not how big the sample is, because sampling error was driven only by the sample size. The question here is whether the sample represents the population about which we want to generalize. You could have a very large sample of 1,000 or 2,000 respondents, and so have a relatively small margin of error. And yet if those 1,000 or 2,000 people don't look like the public as a whole, you've drawn them in some non-random way, that plus or minus 4 or 5% is meaningless, isn't it? Right? So we really need to know about the representativeness of that sample. We'd like the taste of soup to reflect what the larger soup is going to taste like. But if we haven't stirred the soup, if we're scraping the good stuff off the bottom, or we're drawing blood from an artery versus a vein, we're unable to generalize about the larger set of things. Right? So we prefer not to generalize about the red states, interviewing only people in Massachusetts, say. Right? That would be a mistake. Here's the fundamental principle you want to take away, and it's this. A survey is only scientific and trustworthy if the interviewers are choosing the respondents, in fact, choosing them in a random way, rather than the respondents choosing the interviewers. Any survey that relies on the spontaneous participation of the respondents themselves is going to be subject to criticism. These internet polls that ask people to simply find a website, CNN or something else, and vote yes or no, or call in to vote for their favorite sports team or something on the local nightly news, those things are purely for entertainment. In some cases, the journalists reporting them will say that. There's nothing scientific about this. We don't know anything about the larger group of people we could have talked to. All we know is that some people called in and voted yes, and other people called in and voted no. We suspect that the people who call in are the ones with the most intense opinions. Right? They're angry because they think this is a good thing or they think that's a bad thing. And so we know nothing about what the public feels. All we know is that the people who called in feel this way. Right? And so there's a problem there. And so we require that respondents not have control over their own participation. The more they do, the more we are in charge rather than the interviewers being in charge, the more troubling sampling bias becomes. And so we hope that we're using what I call a probability sample. In a probability sampling technique, every respondent has a known chance of being selected. In a perfectly random world, you all have an equal chance of being selected. If I wanted to generalize about the 100 people in this theater today, and I could collect all of your names and randomly draw 10 of them out of a bucket. 10 is not a very big sample size, so the sampling error would be large, but the sampling bias would be small. It would be perfectly random, assuming I mixed the names in that bucket properly. I worry if some of you don't want to talk to me once I draw your names to tell me your views, or if some of you didn't bother to fill out the slip and put it in the bucket in the first place. Right? I've got those kinds of concerns. It's also possible that maybe some of you are more important to me than others. Maybe there's an underrepresentation of some groups or an overrepresentation of others, and so I'd like to give some respondents more weight than others. Maybe some of you came in groups of 2 or 3, and others of you came alone, and I'd like to account for that. And so I need to maybe not give you all an equal chance of being selected, but at least a known chance of being selected. Some of you may have twice the chance of someone else. Your name may be in the bucket on 2 slips of paper rather than 1. But as long as I know that, I can account for it. I've not lost anything in the scientific process. The trouble comes when some of you decide to put names in the bucket and others of you decide not to, right? Then the process is being driven by you rather than by me, and that's trouble. Unfortunately, every survey, even the most scientific of them, suffers from some of this problem in the form of response rates. So let me mention just some of the difficulties in reaching respondents, reaching the people we'd like to interview. We mentioned already sampling error, what we call the margin of error in popular terms, and that's merely a function of cost. If you can afford to interview more people, you drop the sampling error. It's known, it's estimable, it's containable, and it provides you with a sense of security. But sampling bias is a function of things we can't control, not just how many people we interview, but a product of how respondents react to our calls to interview them. whether they're willing to do so or not. The ideal approach, and I hinted at this a moment ago, is what you might call simple random sampling. It's putting names in a hat and drawing out 10 or 20 of them to say something about the public. The only thing I have to decide is how many names I draw out. It's more work for me to draw out 20 than 10. But it's a simple random sample as long as I've mixed. Think about now trying to do that at the national level. You would need a bucket that could hold 200 million names, if it's the adult public, and you need somebody to give you a list of those names. Both of those things are impossible. There's no bucket and not very many computers that can hold 200 million names. And there's no agency, in the United States at least, that provides a list of all Americans. The Census Bureau is our best guess at these things, and I already mentioned that the census misses somewhere between 4 and 5 million people. Now, that's a pretty good rate. They're getting about 99% of the American public, they think. But 4 or 5 million people are probably unlike the other 200 and some million we do end up talking to. So there's a concern there, but not the IRS, not the FBI, no one has a list to give us. And if they did, my guess is it would be out of date the moment we took it from them, because some people have passed on and others have been born and some have moved away from the country and new citizens have come in, right? The world is changing beneath our feet. So a simple random sample is simply impossible. We can't do the thing we'd like to do in theory, the thing about which there is some statistical theory to tell us about the margin of error and other kinds of things. So we've got to approximate it in some way. And about 40 or 50 years ago, we decided to approximate it by calling people on the phone. That was a new technology in the 1950s for lots of folks, and by randomly dialing their numbers. Why not, you say, pick up a telephone book? That's a list of names. Maybe not for the whole country, there'd be a large stack of phone books, but in Boston, couldn't you pick up the phone book and simply begin dialing numbers, every 12th number in the book? Well, the trouble is there are a lot of unlisted numbers. And there are some homes that have 3 telephone lines and others that don't have any. And some of those are business lines, and some of those are no longer good. In fact, that list is out of date as soon as the telephone book is published. It's out of date before it's published, in fact, but it's more out of date the longer we wait. So there isn't even a good list of telephone numbers. And yet we suspect if we could randomly dial numbers, we would get most of the public. Telephone coverage is about 98% in the U.S. today. So all but about 2% of the public has a phone. So we realize there are some biases there, but nonetheless, if we could really randomly get to people by phone, it would approximate a simple random sample. And so we do what's called random digit dialing. And this means being aware of the area codes and the exchanges that are used in particular parts of the country, programming a machine that can randomly dial these numbers. That is, randomly pick an area code from a known list, then randomly pick an exchange from within that list, and then randomly dial the last 4 digits. About 1 out of every 50 of those calls reaches a real human in their house. A large majority of those are non-working numbers because we're randomly dialing them, not taking them from a list provided by the phone company, the government, or anyone else. A lot of those are business numbers and so aren't good for our purposes. Some of those are fax numbers and cell phones, which we'll come to, right? Pagers and the rest. So those are, it's a difficult issue, but it's the procedure we've fallen on. You might suspect that even random digit dialing isn't quite the same as simple random sampling. Even admitting those 2% of American households that don't have telephones, still we suspect that people aren't equally likely to be talked to just because we're all equally likely to have a phone. And I'm going to discuss that in a minute. The other issue is that random digit dialing doesn't work for surveys that are done anyway but by telephone. They don't work for face-to-face interviews. They don't work for mail surveys, internet surveys, or anything else. And so more complicated, multi-stage procedures need to be used in those contexts. So I'm talking to you about the simplest of the real-world methods that happen today. So what are the roadblocks to using random digit dialing? One is that many homes have multiple lines, while others, including mine, only have 1. So if a home next to me has 2 telephone lines and mine has 1, statistically that home is twice as likely to be called as mine. So once we reach a home, the first question practically we ask is how many telephone lines are there in this home? And if it's 2, we give that home half the weight of the home that only had 1. If it's 3, we'd give it a third. If it's 4, we'd give it a quarter. So there's a weighting to account for that. Second issue, each home has a different number of residents. Some homes have 12 people living there, others are a single individual, and we need to account for that. So the second question we tend to ask is how many people are living in the home? And we'd like to weight by the number of respondents there. There's an issue I don't have mentioned there, actually, is who answers the phone. It turns out, for example, that women are more likely to answer the phone than men. That slightly older folks are more likely to answer the phone than slightly younger folks. And so we need to account for that. So we'd like to even randomize the person we talk to within the home. So if we call and we're told that there are 4 people in the home, we'd like to randomly pick one of those 4, not just the person who picks up the phone because they don't represent those 4. And so there are methods, for example, the last birthday method it's called, We then ask to talk to the person with the most recent birthday. And in my mind, that takes some work. It takes me 5 minutes to figure that out. But once it's done, we then speak to that person if they're available. If they're not available, we need to call back and try to speak to that person again, right? So there are methods even for randomizing within a house. A new issue that's come up in this election campaign is that of cell phones. A few years ago, the federal government passed some do not call legislation to take your name off those lists of telemarketers. It exempted surveyors. We're allowed to call you all we want, right, as long as we're not selling something. The one thing it prohibited is calling someone on a cell phone if you don't have their prior permission and the cell phone call might cost them money. That's the issue. For some cell phones, like mine, I pay a monthly contract. It doesn't cost me anything to listen to someone who's given me a call. But for others, if we're roaming or something else, there is a cost. But the pollster doesn't know that when they call the phone. And when the person picks up the phone, if they're already paying for that call, the interviewer has then violated the law. So we've decided not to call any exchanges or area codes that we know are associated with cell phones. And as of today, that's about 5% of people who are exclusive cell phone users. About 5% of Americans use nothing but a cell phone to make calls. Among 18 to 24-year-olds, it's 3 times that rate. So we suspect we're missing young people. We were missing them already because they're mobile and not likely to talk to us. But we're missing them again because they have cell phones and so are even more mobile than they were before. It's an issue that is going to make, unless the law changes, telephone interviewing obsolete in 10 years. We'll be doing something else. Right now, there's not a suitable something else. Internet surveys and the like have their own problems I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. But for the time being, we simply wrestle with this. I don't think it was a severe problem in election 2004. It will be a real problem to wrestle with in 2008. Another issue is a law passed just after World War II that bans interviewers from surveying military personnel. We can't call up people in the armed services and ask them who they're going to vote for. We can ask them all other kinds of questions. What do you think of the president? Do you think of yourself more as a Republican or a Democrat? What do you think about the issues of the day? And try to infer what they're likely to do. But it's a sizable number of people, maybe a growing number of people nowadays, who we can't interview, and so it's hard to reconcile those kinds of things. The more serious of this in this list, though, is refusals. People we managed to contact who were legally allowed to speak to who don't want to talk back to us. This number has been rising over time, and it's not a random subset of the population that refuses to speak to us. If it were randomly distributed, if everyone flipped a coin when an interviewer called and said, oh, I think I'll talk to you if it's heads and I won't talk to you if it's tails, we wouldn't worry. We just have to call more people and it would take more time. The trouble is it's some kinds of people who want to refuse and other kinds of people who are more than happy to speak with us. Right? And so there's not a randomness to that. If there were, it would just be simple random sampling with an extra step. But unfortunately, the refusals aren't random. What can you do to address the problem? One is you can keep calling back a household until you annoy the heck out of the folks and they're willing to talk to you. And in some academic surveys, I was just looking at this week, in some academic surveys we've been known to call back 10, 20, 30, or 40 times to try to reach a respondent. When someone doesn't want to speak to you, you can't replace them by then calling someone else. You can only do that if the refusals were random, but they're not. And so callbacks are one way. Another way is to offer incentives. What if we paid you $5? Would you talk to us then? How about 10? Or 20, or 25. And you worry that sometimes you are not getting what you want for what you paid for, but it's something that's done. Or you try to contact them by other means. If they're not willing to talk to us on the phone, why don't we send a letter on official university or ABC News letterhead saying how much your opinion is valued, how much you're needed for us to say something about the American public, how many people you'll be representing by being one of 500 and saying something about 200 plus million. So there are those kinds of conversion attempts that are made. And the other is that once the survey is done, we can try to weight the results for any biases that we know exist. Often surveys end up overrepresenting women and underrepresenting men. Fortunately, we know what the real mix of men and women in the population is. So we can give the women a little less weight and the men a little more weight to try to balance that out. Or if the age distribution were not appropriate or something, those kinds of things could happen. So there are a number of roadblocks, but there are also some solutions. And the solutions are things you just seldom hear about. So back on response rates, this is the most severe of our roadblocks. I'm showing you response rates. This is the percentage of the American public we sample who is willing to complete an interview from beginning to end by telephone from the 1952 election to the 2000 election. So along the y-axis here is the response rate. If everyone spoke to us, response rates would be up here. If no one spoke to us, response rates would be down there. And I should point out that this is from an academic survey known as the National Election Study. It's a hugely expensive operation run out of the University of Michigan. It's the best survey in the country in terms of response rates. more time and study is invested here than in any of those overnight media polls you hear about in boosting response rates. This is where you hear about 30 and 40 callbacks to reach a respondent. When ABC News or UNH or anyone else does an overnight survey, you're likely to get a response rate of 20 or 30%. Okay? Nonetheless, there's some obvious trends. Back in the 1950s, we were getting response rates in the 80% range. Somewhere here, and I think this is the rise of telemarketing, there's a fall through the 70s, so that as of about 20 years ago, we're talking about 2/3 of the American public willing to speak to us when we call them. That held flat, bumping around through the 80s and 90s. And then here, I think this is the cell phone revolution and pagers and other things in the mid-90s. Response rates are now around 60%. And we're investing more resources today to get 60% than we were in the 1950s to get 80%. Okay, so it's a real issue. And this 40% who's not talking to us does not look like the 60% who is. They're more likely to be young, more likely to be minorities, more likely to be in cities, more likely to be all kinds of things. And so it's troubling. It becomes difficult even to weight the responses because we don't know what the truth is in some cases. What are the consequences of low response rates? Let me give you one example. This again is from the National Election Study, so this is one of the better academic polls you hear about. And I've simply divided the respondents we talked to in 2000 by the number of callbacks made. So there were some people here who were willing to talk to us on the first conversation. We ring them up, and on the chance that they're home, they're willing to complete the interview right there, or even to postpone it and complete it at another time, but no extra callbacks are required. There are some other folks who require a little bit of prodding, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 calls back to try to convince them to participate, and they eventually give in. There are others who take 5 to 10 and some who take more than that. And all I've done, this is one of 1,000 questions we ask, all I've done is simply divide the percent who say they're going to vote for Bush and the percent who say they're going to vote for Gore by the number of callbacks. So if we had stopped here with only people who speak to us on the first instance, we would have gotten close to a 50-50 election, given the margin of error. In fact, that's what it was. This may not be a good example for that reason. But as we go on, the people who are harder to get are more and more and more likely to be Gore supporters, more likely to be Democrats, because they're younger, more likely to be minorities, more likely to be in cities, and so on, and less likely to be Bush supporters. Right? That's one of many items we could have looked at, but I just want to suggest to you that callbacks matter. Had we decided not to bother doing these other kinds of attempts and just replace the people who wouldn't talk to us on the first instance with some other people who would, we would have gotten more Bush supporters and fewer Gore supporters. Okay, so these kinds of attempts are terribly important, but just something you don't hear much about. I want to point out one other fun issue, and that's the issue of estimating voter turnout. We're going to come to this more in a few minutes, but let's imagine after an election, we're asking people what they just did. Tell us why you voted the way you did or whether you voted. This is, from the National Election Study from the 50s to 2000. We simply asked people, did you vote in the last election? And we compare that to the truth because we know what real voter turnout was. And so I plotted both of these for you. This is from the surveys, the percentage who tell us they vote, bumping along. And this is real-world voter turnout, which has been falling, as you know. And I've just drawn a line to kind of summarize what's happening. So in 1950, real turnout was in the low 60s, 65% or something. And about 75% of respondents told us they voted. All right, we're going to come to why that is. Some of that's a bias in the sample. Some of that's misremembering or lying, misreporting of one kind or another. But nonetheless, the gap was not extreme, probably 10 or 12 points. Over time, turnout in presidential elections has fallen to around the 50% mark, though we bumped up a bit this time. And yet, all along, about 75% of the American public tells us they voted. Is it that more people are willing to lie today or have faultier memories today than they did in 1952? I don't think so. It's that the response rates, I showed you a couple graphs back, have fallen. The people we're missing, which in 1950 were 20% and today are more like 40%, are disproportionately non-voters. Right? So by having those folks refuse to talk to us, we are missing non-participants. And so who's left in the sample are disproportionately people who are civically minded. They have a sort of duty that motivates them to vote and a duty that motivates them to answer surveys and a duty to pick up litter and everything else that's good and right in this world, right? So that's a product of a variety of things, but sample bias is one. So we've now talked about two issues that are important. Sampling error, which has to do with the sample size and the margin of error we talked about. It's the one thing we know about, but in some ways is least important. We've just talked about sampling bias, which is whether the sample we talk to represents the public, and that's a more insidious problem in some ways, and one that's less controllable even though we have weighting and other techniques to deal with it. But now I want to talk to what I think is a more it's more fun to think about measurement, how we gather opinions, but also there's more unpredictability there. It's unclear whether we can control this sort of problem behind the scenes the way we control sampling issues. So we're going to think now about the design of questions and how we measure opinions in terms of that rather than the sample itself. One issue we face is that respondents get tired of talking to us. This is from a particularly long survey. Again, it's a national election study. I think this is one of the surveys in the 1980s. So this is not your typical media poll that might ask you 10 questions or an exit poll that might ask you 15. This is about an hour and a half, 2-hour survey by telephone, sometimes face-to-face, over a wide range of issues. It's about voting behavior. It's about demographics. We want to know your income and your age and your race and gender and all those sorts of things. It's about what you think about issues, how you evaluate the candidates, whether you think the economy's gotten better or worse. Everything you can imagine asking, we ask. You get somebody in a room, we're going to nail down these kinds of things. And so each blue bar you see is a question in the survey. So this is question number 1, and this is question 200 or something at the end. The height of the bar shows you the percentage of people who say, I don't know, or I don't have an answer to that, or give us no response. At the beginning of the survey, we're doing pretty well. There are some exceptions. This item here is when we ask people whether they're liberal or conservative. They don't always want to tell us that or know how to place themselves. But aside from a few spikes like those, this question is about who's going to win the upcoming election. Not everyone knows that. But the general pattern is this. It's an upward trend, and so by the end, we just got massive amounts of non-response. Huge numbers of people saying, I don't know. So this is compounded on the response rate problem. This is not unit non-response. This is not a person who's unwilling to talk to us. This is item non-response within a survey. So the items at the end tend to be harder to get valid data on than the items at the beginning. As a result, we sometimes ask the kinds of things that are difficult at the end of the survey. For example, when we ask a person's income in the United States, that's a sensitive question. We don't like to talk about how much we make. As a result, regardless of how long the survey is, we ask income at the end. It's the very last question in the survey because we know things are already going wrong by that point, and so why not throw it in? So there's this issue for interviewers to deal with between the quality of data, the completeness of the data, the representativeness of the data, and its quantity. Would we rather have lots of respondents with information gathered rather quickly, or would we rather have fewer respondents answering, but we think in more depth, or more sincerity, or more genuineness or something? So I already mentioned this distinction between unit non-response, which is a person refusing to speak to us, a person is a unit, and item non-response, where the item is the question. And you've got to deal with both of those things. So we have this looming question of what does it mean when a person says, I don't know? Does it mean that the person doesn't have an opinion on the issue because they know nothing about it? The words we're speaking just don't mean anything to the person on the other end of the phone. Does it mean that the person has lots of attitudes about that issue but can't reconcile with them? They can see good reasons for saying yes and good reasons for saying no, and they're in conflict, and I can't summarize all that in a response. Or is it that they might or might not have opinions, but they're just tired of talking to us? And they're saying don't know to expedite the interview and get to the end and get back to having dinner or whatever it is. So there ends up being this trade-off between what I would call non-attitudes. These are respondents who simply spit an answer out to us to get on to the next item. Yeah, fine, I agree, I approve. We've all done this, haven't we? I've done this. Versus what I would call a biased sample where we limit the responses to people we think are giving us valid responses. So do you want the more genuine side of things, which is a smaller number of respondents, or would you rather have a larger pool of somewhat less maybe genuine attitudes? It's a difficult issue. So let's talk about what I call opting out. These are people who say, I don't know, I have no response, I couldn't tell you, not applicable. Here's a question we've asked over the years, in quotes here at the top. Some people say the 1975 Public Affairs Act should be repealed. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? It's a fun question because there's no such thing as the 1975 Public Affairs Act. But it seems real, doesn't it? It has a date, it has a name, and about a third of the public gives us an opinion. Right? If we add another part to that question that says, do you agree or disagree with this idea, or do you not have an opinion on this issue, or have you not heard enough to say something? Still about a tenth of the public comes through and says, no, I really want to tell you. I strongly agree with this, or I disagree with it. Now, maybe they're confusing it with something else that happened in the 1970s. I mean, campaign finance reform was passed around then, or maybe Public Affairs Act sounds like something that's good. Maybe it's public TV, or we don't know, right? But people are sort of inferring more than is there. We've said something that, you know, this is a referent that doesn't exist, and yet we get opinions about it. So if we get a third or a tenth of the American public giving us views on non-existent issues like these, what does that mean about questions where we have a real referent, right? It's an issue. think about, I've got another one here. I've got to have the actual responses. This is a question about divorce. Here we go. Should divorce in this country be easier or more difficult to obtain than it is now? Forget the stuff in parentheses for the moment. We simply ask this question. Should divorce in this country be easier or more difficult to obtain than it is now? If we ask that question, we get about 45% of the American public saying, I'd like it to be more difficult. And about 22% volunteer, no, I think it's okay the way it is. You didn't ask me, but I think it's about right. So if you were a journalist writing a story based on those data, the story would be, large plurality of Americans think divorce should be more difficult than it is. 45% are in that category, and that swamps the other two categories. That would be the story, and you'd end up writing about why Americans think divorce is too easy in this country. If we allow for this option, do you think you ought to stay as it is now, a kind of middle category? This is almost like adding a don't know option to another question. It's a kind of filter that separates those with strong feelings on one side or the other from those who are somewhere in the middle. We get 40% saying they like it to stay just as it is. The laws are not too hot, not too cold, just right. So the story you would write, if you're a journalist at that time, is large plurality of Americans think divorce laws are just fine. We're never told, at least when I read a story, even in the New York Times, whether the first kind of question was asked or the second kind of question was asked. The question wording is simply absent. And yet it's a huge source of error in surveys. I'm going to put all these question wording effects, and I'll give you some more examples in a minute, in the rubric of this RAS model developed by John Zoller. And the idea is this. First of all, we don't walk around with preformed opinions in our heads waiting to be gathered. That's why I said at the top, we're not collecting these things the way you collect trash or pick up papers at the end of an exam or something. Opinions have to be constructed on the spot. And the surveyor, in the course of defining the question itself in the response categories, is giving the respondent some material with which to construct that opinion. So the wording of the question matters tremendously because it favors some kinds of ideas over others, intentionally or not. All of us have in our heads what Zoller calls considerations, lots of conflicting ideas. Even on issues like abortion, where we think most Americans have very strong views. They're pro-choice or they're pro-life, and there's nobody in the middle. In fact, most of us have some things that push us in both directions. I mean, there are all these things to consider. There's life of the mother, and there's parental consent, and there's the age, and there's the procedure, and there's partial birth, and you name it. And most of us have a variety of feelings about that that are difficult to summarize in one position. And that's abortion is a tough case. On many other issues, defense spending or something else, we've got considerations all over the place. Which ones we happen to grab at the time the surveyor speaks to us is a result of priming. Which of those things are brought to the top of our heads at the moment just before we spit out an answer? And so this RAS model stands for these three stages. First, a person needs to receive a consideration. You need to bump into the idea about parental consent or defense spending being too high while you're in the checkout line or you're talking with your spouse or you're walking through the museum and you hear somebody chatting about things. These things just enter our mind in kind of the free flow of information during the day. It means they're not always consistent with one another. We heard something here and we heard something there, and they aren't easily summarized in one judgment. Not only do you have to hear them, but you have to accept them. So you've got to be willing to let this thing go into your consciousness and then say, you know, actually, that's a good idea. Or I'd never thought about that point of view. So it's something you internalize. And then when the interviewer comes to you, or your friend comes to you saying, hey, what do you think about No Child Left Behind? You sample it just in the way the surveyors sample across those considerations that are in your head. So you need to bring some of them to the top, and certain ones can be favored over others. If you saw a bumper sticker on the way to the meeting, or the question emphasizes some kind of values over others, that raises those issues to the top of the head, and so they get more weight in the opinions that are generated. Okay. So let's talk about question wording. Here are the issues that have to be dealt with. And they're not all consistent with one another. So favoring one means you don't necessarily favor the others. First, we'd like a question that's balanced. We prefer not to lead respondents unnecessarily in one direction or another. Sometimes that means we introduce too much balance. Questions sometimes start out with a kind of script that says, some people think that X, and other people think that Y. Where would you place yourself on the scale? Or do you agree with the X people or the Y people more? The real world actually isn't that balanced, right? We're likely to get more arguments on one side than the other. But nonetheless, that's the norm that's developed in journalism, and it's the norm that's developed in question wording. We'd like to not be too intrusive. Now, these are people's lives, and some questions are personal, and we'd like not to even change their opinions much by the instruments that's used to gather the opinion. We'd like to stay away from jargon if we can, and talk to people just the way they talk to us to keep the setting sort of natural as much as possible. We'd like to be precise, ask about the thing you'd like to know. I tell my students, answer the question that's asked on the exam. Other responses are fine, but I can't grade them as responses to this question. So when you're asking about abortion, ask about abortion and not something else. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And we hope that the responses we get aren't strategic or gamed in some way. We'd like them to be honest reflections of a person's own feelings and values. And that is, all that stuff is harder than it sounds. Let me give you an example of how the order of responses can matter. That is the order of things we offer to respondents. And I'm going to put these under two headings. One is what's called a primacy effect. This is when the thing at the top of a list matters more than things that are down low. The other is a recency effect. These are where things at the bottom of a list matter more. So the candidate whose name is listed at the top of the ballot gets a few more votes than he or she should, just for being first. And the item that's asked at the top of a question gets more responses than it should. So take this question. Would you say that traffic contributes more or less to air pollution than does industry? Seems harmless enough. Which one of these things do you think is a more severe problem? I could have asked it the other way around. Would you say that would you say that industry contributes more or less than traffic to pollution? And depending on which way I ask it, I get different percentages. So when I ask it this way, more people say traffic than industry. When I switch the two, I get more people saying industry than traffic. Sounds like a silly sort of change that's made, but it matters an awful lot. Think about the precision of a question. We'd like to ask about the things we want to know. So here's a question that was actually used in a survey some time ago. Do you agree or disagree that people have a constitutional right to own guns and the government should not regulate gun ownership? Straightforward enough. The trouble is it's double-barreled, to use a pun. It has two questions in one. First, we're asking about whether you think there's a constitutional right. What do you think about the Second Amendment, essentially? The second is, do you think the government ought to regulate gun ownership? If a person says yes or agree, are they agreeing with the first part or the second part or both parts or what? So there are actually four responses that could be given here rather than two, and that just muddles everything, right? Completely meaningless. And if there's a primacy effect, we think they're answering the first question more than they're answering the second. Who knows? There's also this issue of what I call social desirability. People give you the answers they think you'd like to hear. I want to make the interviewer happy. And so you got to be careful when asking about all this controversial stuff, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's affected in part by even how we're doing the interview. So telephone interviews are a little less personal. You can't see the person face to face. They're in some distant place, maybe not even in this country, interviewing you, and so there's sort of less of it. In a face-to-face interview in your living room or in a shopping mall, there's much more of this kind of social interaction that drives responses. Even the race or gender of the interviewer can affect these things. I'll give you one example. 1960 presidential election. It's essentially a tie. Felt a lot like 2000. John Kennedy just squeaked it out. And in surveys we did right after the election, we got exactly that result. We asked people, did you vote for Kennedy or Nixon? And it was dead on 50-50. It's amazing. In the 1964 election, we interviewed people, how'd you vote in this one? And by the way, how'd you vote back in 1960? And in just 4 years' time, we got about 65% saying they voted for Kennedy, and about 35% saying they voted for the loser, Nixon. Right? Now, maybe Nixon voters were dying off at a higher rate than Kennedy voters, but it's possible, but I don't think it's enough to account for that. So we've got some lessons to take from this segment on measurement. First of all, what we think are straightforward questions about gun control or voting or anything else don't necessarily produce straightforward responses. And second, if you're a consumer of surveys, you need to know these things. What was the wording of the question? What was the context? What was the larger questionnaire in which it was asked? This is a graphic I've taken out of USA Today. Every issue of USA Today has a graphic like this. I think they call it a snapshot of the public or something. It's often in the lower left corner of the newspaper. This is just taken from a random day. What are excuses people use to get out of tickets? 59% didn't see the sign, so on. The worry here is we don't know anything about this. We don't know what the sample size was, and that's the least of our worries here. We don't know what the sample bias issues were. Who was interviewed? Are these only commuters? Are these drivers in Massachusetts? Are these people in Wyoming? Are these 18-year-olds and above? Yeah, we don't know. We don't know the question wording. Was this an open-ended question? People could say whatever they wanted. Was it a closed-ended question? Did it follow 23 other questions about accidents, which might have primed them in a particular way? The only thing we know, and this is the most worrisome, is that it was sponsored by an insurance company, right? So there's simply not enough information here to evaluate. You shouldn't run home and tell anyone that 59% of anybody did anything, right? These numbers come out of thin air. Who knows? Let me give you the best example of social desirability, and this is where we'll conclude talking about measurement. We'd like to know who voted in the most recent presidential election so we can compare voters and non-voters and assess the effect of turnout on the outcome. The most straightforward way to do this, the most plain language way to do this is to simply ask, in a survey we might do tonight, did you vote in the 2004 presidential election? Right, that's as direct as it comes. The trouble is something like 75 or 80 or 85% of the public will tell us they did that. And yet we know the truth is far below that. And so we'd like to give people a face-saving way to say, no, I didn't vote. You know, I was well-intentioned, I'm a good person, but I can't give you the answer you want because, no, I actually didn't. So we've tried questions like these. In talking to people about the election, we often find that a lot of people weren't able to vote because they weren't registered or they were sick or they just didn't have time. How about you? Did you vote? You probably didn't, right, in the 2004 elections. We just assume the default position is you probably didn't, and you have to have a really good reason to vote after all. The difference between this question and this one is somewhere on the order of 5 or 10 points. So some people who felt pressure to say yes here say no there. Yet we're not down to the truth yet. We've still overestimated turnout. So maybe there's a confusion over the source in a person's mind of whether they voted or not. They're sort of mixing up whether they voted in this election or whether they voted in the primary or something. No one says that. 2, I thought about voting this time but didn't. There's some desirability there. I usually vote but didn't this time, or I'm sure I voted. So 3 of the 4 categories are really a way to say no. We put all those together, and this question yet deflates voter turnout one more step, a few more points. Still not down to the truth, but getting closer. I'm going to skip this one. This is what you want to know about tonight. It's the thing I have the least to say about, though. How do we predict the outcomes of elections? It's hard. It was especially difficult this year because we knew that turnout was going to be up. We knew that there were a small number of battleground states where all the resources of the campaigns were being targeted. We knew that young people were being mobilized, that labor unions were working, that the Christian right was working, and it was difficult to assess how those things were going to weigh out in the end. And so we're simultaneously sort of calibrating, this needs calibration, some calibrating to what turnout would be and trying to assess how people would vote, and those things are changing as we do the survey. The real issue is how we restrict the population we want to generalize about, or we start with, to a sample of likely voters. But we don't even know how many likely voters there are going to be. If turnout's 50%, then we think it's 50% of the population, and we somehow have to screen those people out. But it might have been 55 or 60. It was unknown. There are 2 ways to do this. One is screening, which is to simply ask people at the top of the survey a variety of questions that tell us whether they're voters or non-voters. Are you registered? Do you know where to vote? Did you vote last time? Do you intend to vote? And if they give us the wrong answers to those questions, we say, thank you very much. We're going to talk to someone else now because we only want to talk to likely voters. You're not important for this purpose. The other is the weighting method is to continue talking to those folks, but asking the same questions and then apply a weight to them that's their probability of voting. So a person who knows where they voted last time and knows where the polling place is and guarantees they're registered and so on, can tell us who they're going to vote for even, gets a higher weight. They're certain voters. Those who give a mix of yes and no answers to those things get less weight. And we simply scroll down that scale of likelihood of voting until we get to the projected level of turnout. So we simply cut off that index at the point where we think turnout will be. So having some experience from previous elections, as, say, the Gallup organization does, can be a good thing in that they have some sense of what worked last time and what didn't. But it can also be a bad thing because every election's different, and this one was very different. That said, they did a pretty good job, an amazing job. Hey, let's stop the scan. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, let's finish. This is each one of these points you see in the figure is one of about 270 polls that I collected over the course of the campaign. From about late February, that's the beginning of the x-axis here. Here's April, June, here's the Democratic Convention, Republican Convention, and here was Tuesday. This is the percentage of the vote each of the polls said Bush was going to get. And this red line is what he actually got, about 51-point-something% by the end. And you'll see that there's some wiggling around. And there ought to be some wiggling around because in April you're a couple hundred days from the election. So people's opinions may very well have been different before the summer transpired. And there's some wiggling here where Kerry's at a big advantage around the convention and so on. And then it tightens up, right? And some wiggling back and forth. But look at where these last polls were in the final weeks. They're clustered right around the eventual result. Absolutely amazing. There were a few polls this time that got it dead on. And I'm just amazed by that. To be assessing turnout and having the response bias problems and the cell phone issues and the military people we can't talk to and the mobilization going on in some states and not others, to get that result right on average. And again, there's a margin of error. We never know the truth. But you sort of put together 5 or 10 different surveys, and we were just right there. It was stunning. Let's not talk about these other guys, these exit polls that are done on Election Day. This is an entirely different matter. It's a different matter because they don't start as probability samples. They don't have a list of all voters. They don't have random digits to dial. They're simply talking to people as they leave polling places. You can try to randomly sample precincts, and that's done. And you can try to randomly grab every 5th or every 10th person as they leave the polling place and ask them what they did. But none of that has as much scientific validity as the telephone surveys before the election do. So in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about exit polls all you like, but I'm just going to alert you that it's a different matter, and I was not terribly surprised that they were off during the day on Tuesday. Some conclusions to walk away with. One is the mantra of the Reagan administration during the Cold War, trust but verify. I don't want to scare you into thinking that polls aren't believable, aren't useful, aren't trustworthy, but I do want to tell you that you ought to make sure you have enough information to evaluate them. Verify that the results you're getting or being told are really there. And so there's some level of criticism you ought to offer at any survey you hear about. And think about these 3 issues we covered tonight. Sampling error, how many respondents are being talked to, what's the plus or minus factor, though that's the least of our worries. Selection bias or sampling bias, have they somehow not managed to talk to a representative group of Americans for whatever reason? And the bigger issues that we're almost never told about, what was the question that was asked? What were the response categories that were offered? What was the context of the larger questionnaire in which that item was found? Keep in mind, I think that surveys are best at comparing the public at different points in time. So to say that Bush's approval rating is lower than it was 5 months ago, I think is real. It's dropped 5 points. There's some apples-to-apples comparison being made there. But saying something about absolute levels, that we definitively know that 49% of the American public approves of the way he's handling his job, I think it's difficult to say given all the issues we've talked about. So keep in mind, surveys are better at some tasks than others. And keep in mind that the question wording effects I've shown you aren't manipulative. These aren't surveyors in most cases, reputable surveyors trying to get particular kinds of responses, but they're really understandable in the light of the RAS model and other theory we've talked about tonight. And you just need to be aware of those kinds of things to be an intelligent consumer. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah, the question's about sampling error and whether that only depends on the sample size and not on the population. That's absolutely right. When the population is large enough, once we get beyond the size of a small town or something, we're talking about a state or a congressional district or the country, all that matters is the size of the sample. And the analogy, I think, again, is drawing blood or tasting soup. It doesn't matter how big the pot of soup is or how big the animal is you're drawing blood from. The same sample will do it as long as everything is randomly mixed. So it really depends on the randomization. And the sample size is all that matters. I could show you the formula at some point. All that matters in determining the margin of error is that numerator, not the denominator. Feels like magic.
Hello? Hello? Yeah? Okay. My question is, well, I have several questions, but the one that I'll throw at you is, would it make sense to, I guess it's around the question of what do we ask when we vote? With respect to, like you've identified very many issues, like for instance, rotated response, differential non-response, and social desirability, and trying to get certain answers. Some of these issues, like for instance rotated responses, it seems to me would apply. You can think of a vote, like a vote for a federal election, as trying a specific kind of poll.
That's right.
Right? Shouldn't a fair voting system incorporate these issues in as much as possible? I guess that's where I'm going.
No, it's a great point. I mean, the best survey for estimating what happens on Election Day is the vote itself. That's the final survey that totally captures what voter turnout will be, and we know, assuming ballot irregularities are not severe, what the final outcome is. And in fact, most election officials have thought about these primacy and other issues when they design ballots. Most, I will say. Didn't happen in Massachusetts this time. For example, the order of responses matters. And so the candidate at the top often gets more votes than the candidates below. And so many communities rotate the order of candidates from one precinct or one district to another. And that's done by a flip of a coin or something. You might remember the California recall election of a year ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger was brought in and Gray Davis was run out. That ballot had something like 135 candidates on it, just a wide open election, which went on for 10 or 12 pages. And California law requires that they randomize the name of those candidates in a complicated way. And so alphabetical order might have been more efficient for a voter. If I want Schwarzenegger or anyone else, Cruz Bustamante, I can simply go down to the B's and find him. The trouble was that wouldn't be fair because the candidates with names that started with A and B and so on would get more attention. In fact, some candidates made up new names that started with A, just the way companies say they're called A1 Roofing or something so they can be first in the phone book. It's the same idea. So surveyors do it when we ask about who you're going to vote for in the upcoming election. We say, to some respondents, we say, will that be George Bush, the Republican, or John Kerry, the Democrat? And to others, we say, will that be John Kerry, the Democrat, or George Bush, the Republican? So that happens at both places. I think in Massachusetts, this time around, the candidates were listed in presidential candidates were listed in alphabetical order by last name. So the first candidate on my ballot, and I think in all of yours, was Badnarik, who's a libertarian candidate, and then Bush was second, and so on. But in other states, there's a randomization that goes on. And even then, it's not quite fair because you're just going to happen to be at the top of a ballot in a very democratic precinct or precinct where there are a lot of people living. And so there are lawsuits that go on for years about these things, candidates who think they were unfairly treated.
During the election, we noticed that the Democrats were very confident that they would win this election, and yet the Republicans beat them by, and it gave the Democrats a great surprise. Do you have an opinion of why the Democrats did not know of this before?
Yeah, it's a good question. When are we willing to look at polling evidence objectively, and when are we driven by our own subjective biases? There's something called the false consensus effect that psychologists talk about, where we think, this is outside the political realm even, we think that more people in the public are like us than really are. So if I ask you your religion or your ethnicity or your favorite hobbies or the television shows you like, you think there are more other Americans who are like you. I like fishing, and there must be millions of Americans who enjoy fishing also. Right? And so Democrats, even inside the campaign, with expertise in polling, are still inclined to say there are more people who agree with us than we think. There's a silent majority out there. The other part of it is simply spin. A campaign that's behind won't admit that because it demoralizes their followers. They want to generate a sense of excitement and momentum and forward motion, and so they simply lie about the data they have inside the campaign. So I think it's a combination of both of those things. Some delusion on the part of people who are behind, and some purposeful misstatement of what polling data they have, or maybe selective emphasis on some kinds of data rather than others.
How do you deal with cross-cultural issues, such as a person maybe not understanding English as well, or answering differently because their culture says not to say certain things?
It's a difficult issue. In the U.S., we have, for example, language issues to deal with. There are cross-national surveys that are done where we have not just language issues from one country to the next, but even the connotation of some words is different in particular cultures or parts of the countries than others. We don't like, at a sort of in theory, we'd prefer not to change the survey any more than we have to from one respondent to the next. Because each time we do, we're introducing other kinds of things. We're not just changing one thing, going from a respondent to the next. We're also changing something about the instrument, so we're changing two things simultaneously. And so we try, it's a difficult balancing act. We try to remain as consistent from one administration to the next. This is like making McDonald's hamburgers. There is a procedure. We'd like not to deviate from it because then the content will be different. The quality of the hamburger will be different in one case than another. And yet we want to be sensitive to language issues and other things, cultural differences, because they're real. And so it's a balancing act. In the U.S., with a national survey here, we're less likely to make any serious changes beyond offering it in Spanish and a few other languages. Cross-nationally, we've got to think about what words mean in different places, even if the translation is fair. For example, the idea of party identification, that you just think of yourself as a Democrat or Republican or something. Not how you vote, not whether you go to a meeting, not whether you give money to a party, but just, I feel like I'm one of them. I'm a Democrat or I'm part of the GOP. That idea works really well in the U.S. Most Americans can just sort of line up in one of those camps. In Europe, it doesn't work. Most Europeans are not able to separate their long-term sense of identity with the party from how they're going to vote in the upcoming election. And that's not to say that's the right or wrong way to do things. It's just a different idea about what parties mean. So it's a difficult issue, and the bigger the cultural differences become, the harder it is for us.
Do you believe that your surveys influence the election?
Do we believe that surveys influence the election?
Let me put it this way.
They do.
Practically.
They do. They do in part because of the social desirability reasons I talked about. Most of us don't like to be in the minority. There are people who enjoy being contrary, enjoy being different. That's fine. We all do that to some degree. We want to differentiate ourselves from the rest of the public. We have identities. But many Americans, at least enough to make a difference, like to be on the winning side of things. We like to root for the team that's winning, so there are more Red Sox fans today than there were a month ago. The example I gave of JFK in 1960, that there are more people who were Kennedy voters in 64 than in 60. There are more people who were Bush voters in 2000 today than there actually were in 2000, so on. And there have been experiments done where we bring people into a laboratory and give them a couple of scenarios. We tell them, and abortion's one where I've seen, we bring people into a lab and we say, did you know that 40% of the American public is pro-choice? Here are some reasons to be pro-choice, here are some reasons to be pro-life. Where would you put yourself on a scale? We bring some other subject into a lab and say, did you know 60% of the American public is pro-choice? Here are some reasons to be pro and against, and where would you put yourself? And the question is whether they're affected by that first piece of information, and they are. There's a kind of bandwagoning effect that happens that people like to pile on to the winning side, in part because if you don't have strong views yourself, or you have conflicting considerations in the RAS model, you've got to grab onto something. And because the other folks in the room or the other folks in the survey have given you a cue, there's some sense that that might be the right thing to do. There are these famous studies done in the 1950s by Solomon Asch, where he brought subjects into a room like this, very dark, with a bright screen, and he offered on the screen 4 lines of different lengths. 3 were in a group off to the side, and 1 was by itself. And he asked people in the room to simply tell me which of the 3 lines that are off in a group is exactly the same length as the one that's sitting by itself. Okay, so the 3 were all different lengths, and one of them really matched the other line. And it was an easy task. Unless you had vision problems or something, you could do the match pretty quickly. But he brought in some ringers to sit in the audience, some Confederates who were working with him to give the wrong answer out loud first. So they'd go down the line saying, which line do you think it is? 1, 2, or 3. Which line do you think it is? 1, 2, or 3. And he would have instructed his participants, these Confederates working behind the scenes, to give the wrong answer. And when it came to that last person, they were internally torn. What do? I really think I know. Am I seeing things? They all said line number 3, but it's got to be line number 2. And in a surprising number of cases, they went along with the majority. They doubted themselves. They doubted their own vision or their own judgment, or maybe I didn't hear the instructions properly or something. Or they simply thought, maybe I'm really right, but I don't want to say that. I'll be ostracized or something. So there are these, and that was one of the most shocking studies. It was done just after World War II, but there are those kinds of pressures all over the place. So your questions about whether polls affect public opinion, they do to the degree that people who are uncertain or not tightly fixed to their opinions hear about them and then react in that kind of bandwagoning way. Yes. Just a follow-up, there are arguments that we ought not release polls just before an election. And some nations have rules like that no surveys can be done or reported within 5 days or a week of an election. I think it's something we're talking about in the U.S. and will continue to.
The question is, it's a follow-up question on the one that was just, do you believe that polls are rendering a disservice to the electoral process?
The question's about whether polls are a detriment. They're somehow undermining the electoral process. I think the degree to which the media are focusing on them as sources of news is problematic. When there is a hole in the news cycle, or there's dead time on MSNBC, or the Washington Post is looking for something to fill a story, they can always do a survey. And the numbers that come out of that are somehow material for a story. If the numbers have changed, it's a story that the public has moved. And if they have not changed, it's a story that the public has stayed the same despite all these other things happening. So I think it's the most severe problem in my mind, in addition to this sort of lack of information we need to evaluate the polls, is that the media rely on them so much as sources of information rather than reflections of real hard news that's happening outside. These are great questions.
All right, if you have a question that wasn't answered, you may be able to catch Dr. Burden for a moment afterwards, but we would like to give him a little break and thank him very much. After seeing that big drop in response rate, I have a new sympathy for pollsters, so thank you for that, and thank all of you for coming. We hope to see you back. Thanks.